Retirement Day. At 52, Walter retired with just under $1.3 million. All of it built from a job he never loved, never quit, and never turned into a business. No startup, no side hustle that scaled. Just 27 years of the same unremarkable habit, repeated so many times until it stopped feeling like a decision at all. To understand how someone gets there, it helps to start at the end and work backward, because the ending is the part that surprises people. Age 52, retirement day. Walter cleared out a desk he'd sat at, in one form or another, for over 2 decades at a mid-sized insurance company where he worked in claims administration. Nobody wrote an article about him. There was a sheet cake in the break room and a card with 40 signatures, half of them from people who'd barely spoken to him in the hallway. His account balance, combining his 401k and a small taxable brokerage account, sat at $1.28 million. He hadn't picked a single stock in his life. He'd never once timed the market. He'd just never really stopped. He remembers driving home that last day with the windows down, in no particular hurry, and feeling almost let down by how ordinary the moment felt. Like the ending should have come with more weight attached to it than a sheet cake and a parking spot he'd have to give up by Friday. Age 45. Rewind to age 45. Walter's balance crossed $700,000 that year, and for the first time, the account was earning more in a good year than his actual salary raises were adding. That's the point where compounding stops being a concept in a textbook and starts being something you can feel, a strange sensation. Walter has described it as watching a snowball you rolled a long time ago finally reach the bottom of a hill it took decades to walk. He mentioned the number once to a coworker over lunch, almost sheepishly, and the coworker didn't believe him at first, assuming he must have inherited something, since nothing about Walter's visible lifestyle suggested that kind of balance sitting quietly in an account nobody ever saw. Age 35. The flattest decade. Rewind again to age 35. This is the flattest, least dramatic decade of the whole story, and also, quietly, the most important one. Walter's contributions stayed almost boringly consistent. Whatever the maximum allowed amount was in a given year, automatically deducted before he ever saw the money in his checking account. He kept it steady through every season, choosing not to inflate it when he received raises, and maintaining the same discipline during the challenging 2 years after his daughter was born, when finances were tighter. He just left it running, the way you'd leave a furnace running in winter without checking on it every day. There's a well-known illustration of exactly this mechanism. Someone contributing around $850 a month starting at 25, earning a steady 7% average return, can cross $1 million by around age 55 without a single dramatic decision in between. Walter's numbers weren't identical to that example, but the shape of the curve was close enough that it might as well have been drawn from his own statements.
During those years, Walter drove the same used sedan for 11 straight years. Not out of some disciplined minimalist philosophy, but just because it kept running, and buying a new one felt like an unnecessary decision to actively make. Looking back, he says that car was quietly one of the more important financial decisions of his life, even though at the time it felt like the absence of a decision rather than a real one. Age 28. The layoff. Rewind further to age 28. Walter got laid off for 4 months, his only real employment gap in the whole story. And it's worth pausing here, because this is the point where many people would have cashed out their retirement account just to cover rent. Walter didn't. He picked up part-time work at a hardware store, cut his spending down to almost nothing, cancelling a gym membership and a streaming subscription he'd forgotten he was even paying for, and left the account untouched, mostly because withdrawing early meant a penalty steep enough to feel like a wall rather than a door. That wall, annoying as it was at the time, turned out to be doing him a favor. He remembers resenting that penalty rule specifically, cursing at it out loud once while doing his taxes, not realizing yet how much it had actually protected him from himself. Age 25. Where it started. Rewind all the way to the beginning. Age 25. Walter started his first real job making $41,000 a year and enrolled in the company retirement plan, mostly because a co-worker in orientation told him to, not because he understood the math behind it. He set his contribution rate at 8%, the plan's suggested default, and never touched the setting again for almost a decade. He couldn't have told you, at the time, what a compound annual return even meant. He just didn't opt out. The co-worker who told him to enroll was Denise, a woman who worked in a completely different department. She left the company within a year and a half, and Walter never spoke to her again. He still thinks about her sometimes, the way you think about someone who handed you something valuable without either of you realizing it in the moment. Age 38. The co-worker who didn't. There's a comparison worth making here, because Walter's story only really makes sense next to someone else's. A co-worker of his, a man named Reggie, who sat 2 cubicles over for almost 15 years, made roughly the same salary as Walter for most of that time, sometimes slightly more. Reggie contributed to his 401k too, but stopped and restarted it constantly, pulling back to 2% during a divorce in his late 30s, ramping back up when things stabilized, then pulling back again during a rough stretch when his son needed braces and a used car in the same year. None of Reggie's individual decisions were unreasonable. Each one made sense in isolation, given what was happening in his life at the time. By the time both men were 50, Walter's balance was a little more than double Reggie's, despite years of nearly identical income. The difference wasn't smarter investment picks or better market timing, since neither man really did either of those things.
It was almost entirely the starts and stops themselves, the compounding that Reggie's account missed out on during each of those pauses. The years his money sat in cash instead of growing while life happened around it. Reggie isn't in financial trouble. He's fine by most measures. He's just going to retire several years later than Walter did, working past the point where Walter had already cleared out his desk, mostly because of a handful of 2-year gaps that felt small and necessary at the time. The philosophy he never read. Here's the philosophy sitting quietly underneath every one of those 27 years, whether Walter ever named it or not. Jack Bogle, who built the first index fund available to everyday investors, spent decades arguing for a version of investing that sounds almost insultingly plain. Buy a broad slice of the market, hold it for a very long time, and resist the urge to do anything clever in between. Bogle's argument wasn't that cleverness never works, it's that it rarely works consistently enough, for long enough, to beat the simple version once you account for fees, taxes, and the very human tendency to sell in a panic at exactly the wrong moment. Walter never read Bogle's actual writing, as far as I know. He just happened to live the strategy by accident, mostly out of a mix of habit and a mild aversion to paperwork. What this story isn't. I think it's worth being honest about what this story isn't. It isn't a story about discipline in the dramatic sense, the kind people usually mean when they use that word, like Walter was gritting his teeth through some daily act of willpower. Most years, he genuinely forgot the account existed. He checked the balance only once or twice a year, and there were entire stretches, particularly during a market downturn in his late 30s, when he deliberately avoided looking because seeing the number drop felt worse than not knowing. During that specific downturn, his balance fell by close to a third over about 18 months, a real, painful drop on paper, one that would have easily topped 6 figures at the time. He didn't log into the account once during the worst of it. A friend of his, watching the same downturn from a self-directed brokerage account he checked daily, sold most of his holdings near the bottom, convinced things were only going to get worse, and never fully reinvested afterward at the same levels. That avoidance, oddly enough,
might have been one of the best financial decisions Walter never consciously made, since it kept him from selling during the exact months when selling would have locked in the loss permanently. He jokes now that his entire investment strategy could be summarized as forgetting on purpose, which isn't quite fair to him, but isn't entirely wrong either. The number that matters more than the final balance. There's a quieter number in this story too, one that matters as much as the final balance. Across those 27 years, Walter never once increased his contribution rate above where he'd originally set it in his 20s, even as his salary roughly tripled. Financially, he was giving up opportunities to earn or grow more money than he actually did. Emotionally, it's probably part of why the habit survived so many years without becoming a source of resentment. He never felt like the retirement account was squeezing him.
It just quietly existed, doing its work in the background, while he lived a fairly ordinary life in the foreground. Taking a modest vacation most years, buying a slightly nicer car eventually, never once feeling deprived in service of some future number he mostly didn't think about. What this actually means for you. If you're 25 right now, or 35, or even 45 and feeling behind, the part of Walter's story that's actually useful, rather than just pleasant to hear, is this. He never made one spectacular decision. There was no single year you could point to and say, that's the year the business became successful. What he had was 27 consecutive years of not undoing a decision he'd made once, half distractedly, in an orientation room, because a coworker mentioned it in passing on his way out the door. Run the same math forward instead of backward for a second. Someone starting today at 25 could land close to where Walter ended up by the early 2050s if they contribute at a similar rate and achieve a similar return. The account doesn't know what year it is. It doesn't know about inflation headlines or which decade felt uncertain. It just compounds at whatever rate the market actually delivers, for however many years you don't touch it. Walter's version of that math already happened and is sitting in a brokerage statement. Somebody reading this is holding the version of it that hasn't happened yet.